Within the seldom visited storage rooms of the Providence Historical Society, a single photograph, taken in March of 1904, had lain undisturbed and utterly forgotten for more than 100 years. The image depicted the esteemed Underwood family arranged formally in the parlor of their opulent Federal Hill residence. The group included Jonathan Underwood, his wife Beatrice, and the household's newest employee, a domestic servant who had only recently been hired. However, a deeply unsettling detail is visible upon close inspection of the portrait, the hands captured within the frame. The servant's right hand, which is resting in a seemingly casual manner on the back of Mrs. Underwood's chair, displays pronounced and distinctive scarring across the knuckles and the palm. What investigators working in 1920 failed to immediately comprehend was that these very same scars had been described in precise detail on 16 separate occasions within official police reports, spanning a period of nearly 2 decades. 16 different witnesses, in 16 independent cases, all gave consistent descriptions of the last person seen with their employers' wives before those women perished under mysterious circumstances, invariably labeled as tragic household mishaps. This particular photograph, which had been buried and overlooked within a collection of evidence from a separate insurance fraud investigation, would ultimately become the key piece of evidence that unveiled the identity of one of the most meticulous and elusive serial killers in American history. Before we proceed further into the story of Elizabeth Hayes and the calamity that she brought upon the wives of Providence's most privileged families, please subscribe to our channel and select the notification bell to ensure you never miss our explorations into dark historical mysteries. We would also love for you to share in the comments which state you are listening from. We truly enjoy connecting with fellow enthusiasts of mystery from all across the nation. The spring season of 1904 would signal the commencement of what newspapers in Providence would later grimly nickname the Widowmaker's Reign, though the true and horrifying nature of that title would not be understood for another 16 years. Providence in 1904 was a city of significant stature, ranking as the second largest in New England. Its considerable prosperity was built upon a foundation of thriving textile mills, a robust jewelry manufacturing industry, and a busy shipping port. The city's most affluent neighborhoods, Federal Hill and Benefit Street, were lined with magnificent Victorian mansions. Their architectural features, Gothic Revival spires and intricate ironwork, stood as clear testaments to the immense wealth generated by Rhode Island's powerful industrial boom. The streets, paved with cobblestones, were illuminated by the flickering glow of gas lamps, where horse-drawn carriages increasingly shared space with the novel motorcar, while the pungent scent of coal smoke mingled with the salty air drifting in from Narragansett Bay. The Underwood family perfectly embodied Providence's emerging aristocracy. Jonathan Underwood, then 43 years old, had amassed his fortune by manufacturing precision instruments essential for the rapidly expanding national railroad industry. His workshop, located on South Main Street, employed over 60 men who produced the brass gauges and complex mechanical components that were critical for keeping America's trains operating safely and on schedule. His wife, Beatrice, age 38, hailed from established old New England lineage. Her father had been a whaling captain operating out of New Bedford before retiring to manage his various investments in textile mills. Their grand mansion on Federal Hill, constructed in 1887, rose 3 stories high and featured large bay windows designed to capture the afternoon sunlight, casting elongated shadows across the home's beautifully polished hardwood floors. Maintaining such a residence demanded constant effort. Coal needed to be hauled down to the basement furnace regularly, the numerous gas lamps required daily trimming and maintenance, and the elaborate Victorian furnishings and decorations necessitated meticulous and careful cleaning. As was customary for families of their social standing, the Underwoods employed several live-in servants, but finding and retaining reliable domestic help was becoming increasingly challenging. The younger women from Irish and Italian immigrant families, who had traditionally filled such roles, were now seeking better-paying employment and greater personal freedom within the textile mills. It was this growing shortage of dependable domestic staff that prompted Beatrice Underwood to place an advertisement in the Providence Journal on March 15, 1904, seeking an experienced housekeeper for a prominent Federal Hill family, promising generous wages for a suitable candidate with good references. This advertisement would indeed attract the exact kind of response Beatrice had hoped for, though for reasons far more sinister than she could ever have imagined. Elizabeth Hayes arrived at the Underwood mansion on a gloomy, overcast March morning. She carried a modest leather satchel and was dressed in a simple, respectable black dress that suggested both professionalism and a state of mourning. She appeared to be in her early 40s, with hair that had already turned grey prematurely, pulled back into a severe style, and possessing pale blue eyes that seemed to absorb and catalogue every minute detail of the rooms she entered. The letters of reference she provided, written on expensive letterhead from wealthy families in both Boston and Hartford, effusively praised her discretion, her exceptional skill in household management, and her noted talent for caring for delicate wives who suffered from the nervous disorders that were unfortunately common among upper-class women of the era. What most impressed Beatrice during their interview was Elizabeth's immediate and intuitive grasp of the numerous complexities involved in running a large Victorian household. She demonstrated exact knowledge of how to properly tend the gas fixtures to avoid creating dangerous leaks, how to efficiently manage the coal-burning stove without filling the rooms with smoke, and how to handle the delicate cleaning required for Beatrice's extensive and valuable collections of crystal and china. Her hands, though visibly marked by old scars, which she explained away as the result of past kitchen accidents, moved with a practiced and confident efficiency as she assessed the household's various needs. "I possess a particular understanding of the needs of ladies who find themselves overwhelmed by their social obligations," Elizabeth told Beatrice in a soft, calming Irish accent. "My previous employers often suffered from terrible headaches and nervous exhaustion. I have learned to prepare special herbal remedies that provide considerable help with such conditions." Her smile was gentle, almost maternal in its warmth, and Beatrice felt immediately and completely at ease with this woman who seemed to intuitively understand the unique burdens of her position. The photograph taken that March afternoon was intended to commemorate the successful completion of the hiring process. Jonathan had recently purchased one of the new, popular Kodak cameras and wished to document their household staff for his business records. The three individuals arranged themselves in the formal parlor. Jonathan stood beside his wife's chair with his hand resting protectively on her shoulder, Beatrice was seated with her hands folded neatly in her lap, and Elizabeth was positioned slightly behind them, her scarred right hand resting on the back of Beatrice's chair in a gesture that seemed both protective and strangely possessive. Neither Jonathan nor Beatrice noticed how Elizabeth's eyes remained intently fixed on Beatrice's jewelry during the long exposure time the photograph required. They could not have possibly known that those pale blue eyes were already carefully appraising the value of Beatrice's diamond earrings, her sapphire brooch, and the elaborate gold bracelet that had been a cherished heirloom from her grandmother. They had no way of understanding that the woman they had so warmly welcomed into their home and their trust was already meticulously planning their impending tragedy. The spring season in Providence typically carried with it a promise of renewal and fresh beginnings, but inside the Underwood mansion, a very different and dark kind of transformation was quietly taking place. Elizabeth Hayes settled into her new role with the chilling efficiency of someone who had already perfected a deadly routine over many years. She rose each day long before dawn to tend to the furnace, prepared all meals with meticulous care, and maintained the entire household with an almost obsessive attention to detail that deeply impressed both Jonathan and Beatrice. Yet, her most critical work occurred during the quiet, solitary hours when the family was asleep, when she could move through the large house like a phantom, silently learning all of its secrets. Victorian homes were complex organisms, full of hidden pipes, ducts, and mechanical systems that very few people ever fully understood. Gas lines ran through the walls to feed the ornate lighting fixtures in every room. Elaborate hot air ducts carried heat from the basement furnace up to the bedrooms on the upper floors. The electrical system, a relatively new installation, often shared space with the older gas lines in ways that could inadvertently create unexpected and deadly hazards. Elizabeth studied these complex systems with the dedicated focus of a trained engineer, meticulously tracing every pipe and wire until she possessed a complete understanding of exactly how the house functioned, and, more importantly, how it could be made to malfunction. Throughout her first month of employment, Elizabeth demonstrated a level of devotion that made her employers feel almost guilty about their previous difficulties with domestic help. She anticipated Beatrice's needs before they were even verbally expressed, prepared Jonathan's morning coffee exactly to his precise preferences, and maintained the entire house with a spotless, flawless efficiency. Most significantly, she seemed to genuinely care about Beatrice's well-being, often commenting on how tired the lady of the house appeared and thoughtfully suggesting various remedies for her frequent headaches. "Mrs. Underwood works herself far too hard," Elizabeth would say to Jonathan with a convincingly concerned expression. All these endless social obligations, the considerable stress of managing such a large household, it is no wonder she suffers from nervous exhaustion. Perhaps she requires more rest, more quiet time away from visitors. Her suggestions always sounded so reasonable, so genuinely caring, that Jonathan gradually began to limit the social events and gatherings that had always been a central source of Beatrice's happiness. The process of isolation began in a subtle manner. Elizabeth would politely inform callers that Mrs. Underwood was currently indisposed, suffering from one of her severe headaches. She would reschedule social engagements, explaining that the family doctor had recommended complete rest. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, Beatrice found herself spending more and more time alone with only Elizabeth for company, becoming increasingly dependent on the servant's companionship and care. The woman seemed to have an innate understanding of her moods, her fears, and her growing sense that something fundamental in her life was changing in ways she couldn't quite identify or articulate. It was during the 4th week of May that Beatrice first confided in Elizabeth about experiencing strange and disturbing dreams. She described vivid, terrifying sleep filled with images of suffocation and falling. She would wake up gasping for air, her nightgown soaked through with perspiration, and was often convinced that someone had been in her room during the night. Elizabeth listened to these confessions with sympathetic attention, suggesting that perhaps the gas lamp in the bedroom was not burning properly and was somehow affecting Mrs. Underwood's sleep. These older gas fixtures can be terribly temperamental, Elizabeth explained knowledgeably as she made adjustments to the bedroom lamp's mechanism. Sometimes they fail to burn cleanly, particularly during the night when the gas pressure tends to change. The resulting fumes can cause the most terrible nightmares and feelings of unease. Her skilled fingers worked expertly on the fixture, making subtle adjustments that she claimed would improve the air quality in the room. What Beatrice could not see was how those same skilled fingers could simultaneously create a nearly invisible, carefully controlled leak designed to release just enough raw gas to cause disorientation, weakness, and confusion without immediately threatening her life. The first serious incident occurred on the night of May 29, 1904. Jonathan was away from home, attending a business dinner in downtown Providence, leaving Beatrice alone in the house with Elizabeth for the evening. They dined together in the smaller, more intimate breakfast room rather than the formal dining room, Elizabeth having suggested that the cozier setting would be more relaxing for Mrs. Underwood's fragile nerves. The meal was simple yet elegant: roasted chicken with herbs, fresh vegetables from the garden, and a bottle of wine that Elizabeth had specifically recommended for its calming properties. As they ate, Elizabeth spoke fondly of her previous employment with wealthy families in Boston, describing the tragic circumstances that had, she claimed, led to her seeking new positions. Her former employer, a Mrs. Victoria Livingston, had been very much like Beatrice, refined, intelligent, but deeply troubled by the immense pressures of social expectations. She used to tell me that she felt utterly trapped by all the obligations, the constant need to maintain appearances, Elizabeth said with a wistful, sorrowful expression. Poor dear, she never found any real peace until the very end. Beatrice, in turn, found herself confiding her own personal struggles, the exhaustion of managing countless social obligations, the pressure of maintaining Jonathan's important business relationships, and the growing, unsettling sensation that her life was somehow slipping away from her without her consent. Elizabeth listened with the rapt attention of a confessor, occasionally reaching across the table to pat Beatrice's hand reassuringly with those scarred fingers that seemed so gentle and understanding. After they finished dinner, Elizabeth suggested they retire early, noting that Mrs. Underwood appeared particularly tired. She helped Beatrice prepare for bed, brushing her hair with long, soothing strokes and ensuring that the bedroom was properly ventilated. The gas lamp burned with a steady, seemingly normal flame, casting dancing shadows on the room's wallpapered walls. Elizabeth kissed Beatrice's forehead in a gesture that felt almost maternal before retiring to her own room in the servants' quarters. What transpired during the hours that followed would later become the subject of intense investigation, though the full truth would remain hidden for another 16 years. Beatrice Underwood was discovered the next morning at the bottom of the main staircase, her neck broken from what appeared to be a tragic accidental fall. She was dressed in her silk nightgown and was wearing her grandmother's gold bracelet, but her diamond earrings and sapphire brooch were conspicuously missing from her bedroom jewelry box. Elizabeth's screams upon discovering the body brought neighbors rushing to the scene. Her grief appeared utterly genuine and profoundly overwhelming as she knelt beside Beatrice's broken form, cradling the dead woman's head and sobbing uncontrollably about how she should have heard something, should have been able to prevent the tragedy. When Jonathan arrived home, having been summoned by an urgent telegram from his business meeting, he found Elizabeth still holding a vigil beside his wife's body, her dress stained with blood and her face streaked with tears. The Providence Police Department in 1904 operated with the limited investigative techniques available during that era. Detective Captain William Brennan, the son of Irish immigrants who had worked his way up diligently through the ranks, arrived at the Underwood mansion on that grey May morning expecting to document yet another tragic household accident. Victorian homes were notorious for such unfortunate incidents: gas leaks, falls down steep staircases, and accidents involving coal furnaces and poorly understood electrical systems were all too common. Captain Brennan's initial examination of the scene suggested what appeared to be a straightforward case of accidental death. Beatrice Underwood had apparently risen during the night, perhaps to use the water closet or to investigate a noise, and had somehow lost her footing on the home's polished wooden stairs. The steep, dramatic Victorian staircase, with its elaborate banister and a runner that could easily shift underfoot, had tragically claimed other victims in Providence's grand homes over the years. Her injuries were medically consistent with a fall from the top landing down to the hard marble floor of the entrance hall below. Elizabeth Hayes provided a clear, coherent, and seemingly truthful account of the evening's events. She had served dinner, helped Mrs. Underwood prepare for bed, and then retired to her own quarters in the servants' wing around 10 p.m. She claimed to have heard nothing unusual during the night, sleeping soundly until she awoke at her customary time of 5:30 a.m. to begin her morning preparations for breakfast. Upon realizing that Mrs. Underwood had not come downstairs for her morning tea, Elizabeth stated that she had gone upstairs to check on her employer, only to find the bedroom empty and then discover the horrific scene at the bottom of the staircase. Jonathan Underwood, utterly devastated by the sudden loss of his wife, accepted the tragedy as one of those cruel, random accidents that could befall even the most careful of households. The matter of the missing jewelry was easily explained away. Beatrice often removed her earrings and brooch before retiring, and in his profound grief, Jonathan could not remember with certainty exactly what pieces had been in her jewelry box. The items might have been taken out for cleaning or repair, or perhaps they had simply been misplaced in the chaos and distress that followed the discovery of the body. What Captain Brennan did note in his official report, though he did not consider it significant evidence at the time, were the distinctive scars visible on Elizabeth Hayes's right hand as she gestured while describing the evening's events. The old wounds were clearly visible across her knuckles and palm. When he inquired about them, she explained calmly that they were the result of a severe kitchen accident years earlier, when she had fallen against a hot stove while working for a family in Hartford. The explanation seemed perfectly reasonable for someone who had spent many years in demanding domestic service. Elizabeth remained with Jonathan Underwood throughout the difficult weeks following Beatrice's funeral, helping him manage the household and cope with his overwhelming grief. She proved herself invaluable during this period, handling all correspondence with sympathy callers, managing the constant influx of food and flowers from concerned neighbors, and maintaining the house's daily routine when Jonathan seemed incapable of making even the most basic decisions. Her steady presence provided a crucial sense of stability during the very worst period of his life. By the late summer of 1904, however, Jonathan began to feel that maintaining such a large household was beyond his current needs and emotional capacity. The mansion held far too many painful memories of Beatrice, and he found himself seriously considering a move to smaller quarters downtown, closer to his business. When he mentioned these thoughts to Elizabeth, she immediately understood that her services would soon no longer be required. She accepted this news with graceful resignation, expressing only sincere concern for Mr. Underwood's future well-being and profound gratitude for the opportunity to serve such a fine family during their time of greatest need. On September 15, 1904, Elizabeth Hayes departed the Underwood mansion carrying the same small leather satchel she had arrived with months before. Jonathan provided her with exceptionally generous compensation and an excellent letter of reference that praised her dedication and compassion during the family's darkest hours. She mentioned that she planned to seek new employment in Hartford, where she had connections from her previous work. Jonathan wished her well and never expected to hear from or about her ever again. What Jonathan could not have possibly known was that Elizabeth's departure from Providence was only a temporary maneuver. She would return to Rhode Island within 2 years, though not to the same neighborhood or social circle where she might be recognized. The massive industrial expansion of the early 1900s had created abundant opportunities for a woman with her particular skills and knowledge, especially among the newly wealthy families who were building grand mansions in Providence's expanding suburbs. These new industrialists, men who had recently made fortunes in manufacturing, shipping, and trade, often married women from more modest backgrounds who suddenly found themselves struggling to manage elaborate households and complex social obligations they were unprepared for. They were perfect targets for someone who understood exactly how to exploit the vulnerabilities of wives who felt overwhelmed, isolated, and insecure in their new stations in life. Between 1906 and 1918, Providence would witness a deeply disturbing pattern of household accidents involving the wives of prominent businessmen. These incidents shared several chilling characteristics. They typically occurred when the husbands were away on business trips, the victims were always discovered by a recently hired domestic servant, and small but valuable items of personal jewelry often went mysteriously missing in the confusion following the discovery of the bodies. However, these similarities were not immediately apparent to the various investigators working on individual cases that were separated by many months or even years in different jurisdictions. This pattern might have continued indefinitely if not for a fateful intersection of tragedy and greed that would finally expose Elizabeth Hayes in 1920. An insurance investigator, meticulously reviewing claims from these seemingly unrelated household accidents, would eventually discover the connections that had eluded police departments for nearly 2 decades. But that crucial revelation still lay 16 years in the future as Elizabeth Hayes continued her deadly work with the cold confidence of someone who had perfected what she believed was the perfect, invisible crime. The photograph taken in the Underwood parlor that March afternoon in 1904 remained filed away, utterly forgotten among the routine documentation of a tragic accident. Those scarred hands, captured forever in the silver emulsion of the photograph, waited patiently to finally tell their full story to someone who would understand their terrible significance. The years following Beatrice Underwood's death saw Providence transformed by the immense industrial prosperity of the early 20th century. New fortunes were built on manufacturing precision instruments, processing rubber, and managing the complex logistics of New England's rapidly expanding economy. With these great fortunes came new mansions, new social hierarchies, and new opportunities for those who understood how to navigate and exploit the vulnerabilities of the wealthy. Elizabeth Hayes, now using the alias Catherine Lynch, established herself in Hartford only briefly before returning to Rhode Island in 1906. She had learned to vary her appearance in subtle ways, different hairstyles, slight changes in her manner of dress, and careful modulation of her accent depending on her prospective employer's expectations. For families seeking Irish domestics, she emphasized her heritage. For those preferring English servants, she softened her brogue and spoke instead of her employment with prestigious Boston families. Her forged references, written on stolen or counterfeit letterhead from towns where verification would be difficult or impossible, painted a consistent portrait of an experienced, trustworthy housekeeper who specialized in caring for delicate mistresses prone to nervous conditions. Her second Providence victim was Margaret Tillinghast, wife of the wealthy textile manufacturer David Tillinghast, whose enormous Elmwood mansion represented the pinnacle of ambitious 1890s Gothic Revival architecture. The house, with its complex network of gas lines and an elaborate steam heating system, provided Elizabeth with new challenges and fresh opportunities. Margaret, 20 years younger than her husband and struggling desperately to manage social obligations that felt far beyond her capabilities, welcomed Elizabeth's arrival in October 1906 with a sense of desperate relief. The pattern that Elizabeth had so perfectly perfected in the Underwood household repeated itself with deadly, mechanical efficiency. She began by systematically isolating Margaret from her friends and family, suggesting that social gatherings were too taxing for someone of her delicate constitution. She prepared special meals and herbal remedies that gradually weakened Margaret's energy and clouded her concentration. Most importantly, she spent hours each night studying the house's complex mechanical systems, learning exactly how to engineer the perfect accidental death. Margaret Tillinghast was found on December 12, 1906, apparently overcome by toxic gas fumes in her bedroom. The ornate gas chandelier had supposedly malfunctioned during the night, filling the sealed room with deadly vapors while Margaret slept. Elizabeth, whose room was conveniently located in a different wing of the large house, discovered the tragedy when Margaret failed to appear for breakfast. The seemingly grief-stricken servant had managed to open windows and summon help, but it was, of course, far too late to save her employer. Detective Captain Brennan, now promoted to lead Providence's entire detective division, investigated the Tillinghast death with the thoroughness that his extensive experience demanded. Gas accidents were, unfortunately, common occurrences in homes with older fixtures, particularly during the winter months when windows were kept tightly closed and ventilation was poor. The chandelier in Margaret's bedroom did show signs of mechanical failure that could easily have occurred naturally over time. Elizabeth Lynch, as she was known there, provided a detailed account of the evening, mentioning that she had noticed the gas burning with an unusual, yellowish color the previous day and had actually planned to recommend calling a repair service. What struck Brennan during the interview, however, was a vague but persistent sense of familiarity. Her scarred right hand, visible as she gestured during their conversation, seemed somehow familiar, though he could not immediately place where he might have encountered her before. When he mentioned this impression, Elizabeth smoothly explained that she had previously worked for the Underwood family and had spoken with police following poor Mrs. Underwood's tragic fall. The connection seemed reasonable enough. Providence's community of domestic servants was relatively small, and experienced housekeepers often moved between prominent local families. The matter of the missing jewelry from Margaret Tillinghast's bedroom was explained away by Elizabeth's suggestion that Mrs. Tillinghast had recently had several pieces sent out for cleaning and repair. In the chaos and grief following the discovery of the gas leak, no one could remember with certainty exactly which items had been sent to the jeweler. David Tillinghast, consumed by guilt over his wife's death and his own frequent business absences, accepted these explanations without question. Elizabeth remained with the Tillinghast household through the winter of 1907, helping David manage his grief and the complex process of closing down such a large establishment. When he decided to move to a smaller house in downtown Providence, she accepted her dismissal with the same graceful resignation she had shown Jonathan Underwood. Her references from the Tillinghast family praised her devotion during their time of crisis and recommended her without reservation to future employers. Between 1907 and 1918, Elizabeth Hayes, using various aliases and slight modifications to her appearance, would claim 13 more victims across Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. She developed an almost scientific approach to her crimes, deliberately varying her methods to avoid establishing a recognizable pattern for investigators. Some women died in falls, others from gas leaks or electrical accidents. A few suffered what appeared to be sudden heart attacks, brought on by gradually administered poisons that cunningly mimicked natural illnesses. Her continued success depended on several key factors that made detection nearly impossible given the investigative limitations of the era. First, she always worked as a live-in domestic, giving her intimate, round-the-clock access to her victims' routines and the mechanical systems of their homes. Second, she deliberately chose victims who were already suffering from anxiety, depression, or physical ailments, making a sudden death appear medically plausible. Third, she moved frequently between cities and even states, ensuring that no single police department would ever be investigating multiple, similar cases. Most importantly, Elizabeth possessed a deep understanding of the social dynamics that protected her from suspicion. Domestic servants occupied an invisible, often ignored position in upper-class households. They were essential to daily functioning but were rarely truly seen by the families they served. Police investigators of the time rarely considered the possibility that a seemingly grieving, helpful servant might be the actual architect of her employer's death, particularly when that servant appeared genuinely devastated by the loss and provided such cooperative testimony about the victim's final days. The scarred hands that had been noted in police reports from 16 different investigations over 14 years represented the only consistent physical evidence linking these crimes. But without any centralized record-keeping or communication between different jurisdictions, no single investigator had access to the complete, horrifying pattern. Each case was investigated in isolation, filed away as another tragic household accident, while Elizabeth Hayes continued her deadly work with increasing confidence and chilling sophistication. By 1918, Elizabeth Hayes had refined her methods to an art form that would have continued indefinitely if not for an unexpected complication. Her latest victim, Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald of Newport, had died in what appeared to be a tragic fall down the servants' stairs while investigating a supposed disturbance in the kitchen. Elizabeth, now calling herself Mary Sullivan, had been employed by the Fitzgerald family for only 6 weeks, but her performative grief over the accident seemed utterly genuine and heartfelt. She had immediately summoned help, stayed with Mrs. Fitzgerald's body until the doctor arrived, and provided detailed testimony about the events leading to the tragedy. What Elizabeth did not know was that Mrs. Fitzgerald's nephew, Thomas Brennan, Jr., was a recent graduate of Harvard Law School who had developed a keen interest in the emerging field of forensic investigation. Young Brennan had heard stories from his father, Providence Detective Captain William Brennan, about a strange series of household accidents that seemed to plague Rhode Island's wealthy families. When his own aunt became another victim in this pattern, Thomas decided to conduct his own informal investigation into what he began to suspect might not be accidents at all. Thomas began by examining the physical evidence at the Fitzgerald home more carefully than the local police had done. The servants' stairs, where his aunt had fallen, were in excellent repair, with new carpeting and a sturdy, reliable banister. Eleanor Fitzgerald, though in her 50s, had been in remarkably good health with no prior history of balance problems or dizzy spells. The supposed disturbance in the kitchen that had drawn her downstairs at midnight had left behind no physical evidence, no broken dishes, no signs of a forced intrusion, no indication whatsoever of what might have caused the noise that Mary Sullivan claimed to have heard from her room. More troubling was Thomas's discovery that several valuable pieces of his aunt's jewelry were missing from her bedroom. Mary Sullivan suggested that Mrs. Fitzgerald might have hidden them for safekeeping due to recent reports of burglaries in Newport, but Thomas found no evidence whatsoever that his aunt had been concerned about theft. The missing items, a diamond necklace, emerald earrings, and an antique gold bracelet, represented several $1,000s in value, a significant loss that seemed highly suspicious in direct connection with an accidental death. Thomas's legal training had taught him the critical importance of systematic investigation. He began diligently researching similar cases of accidental death involving wealthy wives throughout New England. What he discovered alarmed him deeply. Over the previous 14 years, at least 16 wives of prominent businessmen had died in bizarre household accidents, and in every single case, the family had recently hired a new domestic servant who had been the one to discover the body. These servants were always women between 40 and 50 years of age, always carried excellent references from previous positions, and always seemed profoundly devastated by their employers' deaths. The crucial breakthrough came when Thomas visited his father's office in Providence and reviewed the old, archived case files. Detective Captain Brennan had maintained detailed, meticulous records of his investigations, including physical descriptions of all witnesses and potential suspects. As Thomas read through these files, a terrifying pattern began to emerge, a pattern that had been completely invisible when each case was considered in isolation. 16 different investigations over 14 years had each documented conversations with a domestic servant who bore distinctive, described scars on her right hand. "Look at this, Father," Thomas said, spreading the dusty files across Captain Brennan's desk. March 1904, the Beatrice Underwood case. You noted that the housekeeper, Elizabeth Hayes, had old scars across the knuckles and palm of her right hand. December 1906, the Margaret Tillinghast case. The housekeeper, Catherine Lynch, had similar scars from what she claimed was a kitchen accident. Here's another from 1909. And another from 1912? Every single one of these cases mentions the same type of scarring on the right hand of a domestic servant. Captain Brennan studied the files with growing amazement and dawning horror. The pattern his son had identified was undeniable, but it seemed almost impossible to believe. Could one woman have been responsible for 16 deaths across the states over 14 years? Could she have operated with such brazen impunity, moving from household to household, family to family, without ever arousing serious suspicion? The physical descriptions vary slightly, Captain Brennan observed, scanning the pages. Different hair color, different names, different reported accents, but the age is always about the same, and those scars. He paused, his blood running cold as he remembered his most recent encounter with a domestic servant bearing such distinctive marks. "My God, Thomas, I think she may have been in my office just 3 months ago." The investigation into Eleanor Fitzgerald's death had brought Captain Brennan into contact with Mary Sullivan, the grief-stricken housekeeper who had discovered the body. He remembered her scarred right hand, her convincingly flowing tears, her detailed account of the night's tragic events. If Thomas's theory was correct, Captain Brennan had been standing face-to-face with one of the most prolific killers in New England's history without even realizing it. The challenge now was proving a definitive connection between Mary Sullivan and the previous crimes. Without fingerprint databases or other modern identification techniques, establishing that multiple servants were actually the same woman would require meticulous detective work and, ideally, photographic evidence that could visually link her to previous investigations. It was Thomas who remembered the old photograph. During his thorough review of the Underwood case file, he had noticed a brief reference to photographic evidence taken at the scene. While most police departments routinely photographed crime scenes by 1904, few maintained organized, accessible archives of such evidence. If the photograph of Elizabeth Hayes from the original Underwood investigation still existed, it might provide the irrefutable proof needed to establish her connection to all the subsequent crimes. The search for that single, crucial photograph would lead the Brennans into the dusty, neglected archives of the Providence Police Department, where 16 years of evidence from unsolved cases waited silently to reveal their long-buried secrets. What they would find there would not only confirm Thomas's terrifying theory but would also provide the key to finally capturing one of the most successful and elusive serial killers in American history. Just when it seemed the full horror had been revealed, the mystery in Providence intensified. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark historical mysteries. Hit the like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The basement archives of the Providence Police Department in 1920 were a chaotic maze of overstuffed filing cabinets, unlabeled evidence boxes, and forgotten case materials representing 2 full decades of criminal investigations. Detective Captain William Brennan and his son Thomas descended into this bureaucratic netherworld on a cold February morning, armed with a list of case numbers and dates that they hoped would finally yield the photographic evidence needed to prove their incredible theory. The Underwood case file from 1904 was eventually located in a mildew-dusted box marked "Accidental Deaths, Closed Cases." Inside, nestled among witness statements and official investigation notes, was the photograph that Jonathan Underwood had taken on that March afternoon 16 years earlier. The image, though somewhat faded with time, clearly showed the 3 figures posed in the parlor of the Federal Hill mansion, Jonathan standing beside his wife's chair, Beatrice seated with her hands folded demurely, and Elizabeth Hayes positioned behind them with her scarred right hand resting prominently on the back of Beatrice's chair. Thomas examined the photograph intensely with a magnifying glass, studying every detail of Elizabeth Hayes's face and posture. Even accounting for the natural changes that 16 years would bring, he was convinced that this was the very same woman who had been working as Mary Sullivan in his aunt's household. The bone structure, the specific way she held her head, the distinctive positioning of that scarred hand, all were chillingly consistent with his memories of the seemingly grieving servant who had discovered his aunt's body. But photographic evidence alone would not be sufficient to build a solid legal case against a woman who had operated under multiple identities across several states. Captain Brennan knew that they would need to trace Elizabeth Hayes's movements systematically, connecting her to as many of the suspicious deaths as possible through documentation that would hold up in a court of law. This meant formally requesting case files from police departments in Hartford, Boston, Newport, and all the other cities where similar accidents had occurred. The process of gathering this evidence was complicated by the limited communication networks between law enforcement agencies in 1920. Each request for information required formal written correspondence, and many smaller police departments had poor record-keeping systems that made retrieving old case files difficult or sometimes impossible. Captain Brennan used his professional connections and hard-earned reputation to expedite these requests, but the comprehensive investigation still took many months to complete. Meanwhile, Thomas had undertaken the challenging task of tracking Elizabeth Hayes's current whereabouts. If she was indeed responsible for the pattern of deaths they had identified, she would almost certainly have moved on to another position shortly after the Fitzgerald incident. Thomas contacted domestic employment agencies throughout New England, providing detailed descriptions and asking about any recent placements of experienced housekeepers who matched Elizabeth's general characteristics. The crucial breakthrough came in May 1920 when an employment agency in Hartford contacted Thomas about a woman named Helen Murphy who had been placed with a wealthy family in Stamford, Connecticut, just 2 months after Eleanor Fitzgerald's death. The physical description provided matched Elizabeth Hayes exactly, including the telltale scars on her right hand that she had explained to her new employers as the result of an old kitchen accident. Captain Brennan immediately contacted the Stamford Police Department, requesting that they place Helen Murphy under discreet surveillance while Providence prepared formal charges based on the evidence they had accumulated. The request was handled with extreme delicacy, as alerting Elizabeth to police interest would certainly cause her to vanish before she could be arrested. Stamford detectives began monitoring the household where she worked, noting her daily routines and documenting her interactions with her current employer, Mrs. Dorothy Whitman. What the surveillance revealed was deeply disturbing. Helen Murphy was already implementing the same isolation tactics that had preceded her previous crimes. She had convinced Mrs. Whitman that social gatherings were too taxing for someone of her delicate constitution, gradually reducing the woman's contact with friends and family. She had taken over complete management of household medications and meals, always claiming to be concerned about Mrs. Whitman's health and well-being. Most ominously, she had been observed spending long periods alone in the basement where the house's gas and heating systems were located. The decision to arrest Elizabeth Hayes was made on June 15, 1920, when Stamford detectives reported that she had been seen tampering with gas fixtures in Mrs. Whitman's bedroom during the early morning hours. Captain Brennan traveled to Stamford personally with an arrest warrant and a team of officers, planning to take Elizabeth into custody before she could claim another victim. The arrest took place on a bright June morning as Elizabeth was leaving the Whitman house to purchase groceries in downtown Stamford. She was walking calmly along a tree-lined street, carrying a small market basket, when Captain Brennan approached her from behind and identified himself as a police officer. Her reaction was immediate and profoundly telling. Rather than showing confusion or surprise, she displayed the calculating calm of someone who had always known this moment would eventually arrive. "I suppose you finally figured it out," she said quietly, setting down her basket and extending her hands to be handcuffed without resistance. "I wondered how long it would take." Her scarred right hand, the hand that had been described in 16 separate police reports over as many years, trembled only slightly as Captain Brennan secured the restraints. During the train journey back to Providence, Elizabeth Hayes remained largely silent, staring out the window at the passing New England countryside that had been the stage for her 16-year killing spree. When Captain Brennan asked her why she had committed such terrible crimes, she turned to him with those pale blue eyes that had seemed so kind and understanding to her victims. "You wouldn't understand," she said simply. "Those women had everything. Beautiful homes, devoted husbands, security, respect. They had lives that girls like me could never hope for, and they spent their time complaining about how difficult it all was." Her voice carried no remorse, only a cold, deep-seated bitterness that had apparently driven her to destroy.